The black Mercedes 770 hurtled out onto the Reichskanzlerplatz. With tires squealing, the car's body rolled as its driver depressed the accelerator to the floor. Within, there was an energy unlike any other. Not 5 minutes before, Joseph Goebbels had collected the phone belonging to the apartment of his wife, Magda. Pressing the receiver to his ear, the voice that came through was that of Ernst Putzi Hanstengel. The news, which Hanstengel carried, was dismissed initially as fantasy by Goebbels. However, shortly after, when another phone call shook the receiver in its cradle, Goebbels knew it was not a fantasy or a ploy. The Reichskanzler Adolf Hitler was happily tucking into his dinner and enjoying the relaxed conversation as he rode high on speeches delivered in Munich and Nuremberg, reciting points with which he'd enthralled the crowd, numbering in the thousands that had been gathered before him, to his hostess, Magda Goebbels. But then Joseph Goebbels returned to the room with the news. Now Reichskanzler Hitler, Berlin Gauleiter Goebbels, held tight as the driver weaved to make good headway. The Reichskanzlerplatz, its elegant U-Bahn entrances, central park space surrounded by wide roads ruttered with the lines of the Berlin street trams, and slowly becoming dominated with the refined modernism of the architecture of Heinrich Mendelssohn in the form of the Deutschland House and America House faded behind them. The tower of the America House functioning as a beacon from where they had left as they sped down the Charlottenburg Chaussee towards a great glow in the distance. The needle of the speedometer pushed 100 kilometers an hour, as the buildings of the broad street that traversed west to east blurred beyond the windows. In the front of the car, the Reichskanzler Hitler was giddy with excitement. This was it, he proclaimed. The communists, the Marxists over whom he had ranted and raved a few days prior, had committed their final act. This was it. This was their move. Soon the gates of Charlottenburg approached. The apartment buildings made way for the Grand Technisches Hochschule, set back and rising in its neo-Romanesque grandeur. Beyond the gates, however, there were no buildings to be seen. The streets that had been bordered by the sum results of brick and mortar returned to the primeval as the Tiergarten spread beyond the trees, becoming a great darkness except for that distant glow that seemed not so distant anymore. Speeding forth, the Mercedes made great progress as the boulevard sat empty. Directly ahead, silhouetted against the backdrop of the central boulevard of Berlin, unter den Linden, the Brandenburger Tor. Unknown to those in the car, Hitler and Goebbels, in the guardhouse of this Brandenburger Tor, a half-naked Dutchman by the name of Marinus van der Lubbe was sat. His body darkened by the effects of smoke, his pockets emptied by the three men stood around him, two standing in the uniforms of the Prussian police, the other in a dark, pinstriped suit, his face pointed, his cheeks scarred, and his hair swept back. The two uniformed officers, Helmut Heissig and Walter Zirpins, looked upon the disheveled figure of Marinus van der Lubbe before them. He was a figure whose hair rose tall like the flames that now burnt 200 meters away. His chest was bare apart from the suspenders that held his trousers, too large for his waist up. Heissig and Zirpins asked the wandering Dutchman had he set the fire, whom had helped him, and why had he burnt the Reichstag down. To all of their surprise, the figure answered openly. He had set the fire. He had acted alone, and it was to put an end to the NSDAP, to begin a revolution. The papers that were found within his pocket had been laying out upon the table. Now they were being thumbed by the third man. The third man, whose face was smooth but for the gouge of a cut long healed into a scar. He was a man whom had risen through the ranks of the Prussian Ministry of the Interior, whom had been tasked with targeting political radicals, both members of the KPD and the NSDAP, and had become head of the Preußische Geheimstaatspolizei and taken under the wing of the president of the Reichstag, Hermann Göring. His name, Rudolf Diels. Diels, not only because of his position within the Preußische Geheimstaatspolizei, was amongst the first of the political elite to be present that evening. His home, luxurious for its proportions and its location, in the summer looked out onto the thick blanket of leafy trees of the Tiergarten, But at the end of winter, when buds still shied away from the grand neoclassical windows, he could see through the skeletal boughs of the trees, not only the Kroll Opera House, but also the Reichstag beyond. It is not clear, however, if Diels was at home, or if he was in his office in the Prussian Ministry of the Interior, which also happened to look out upon the Reichstag building. Nevertheless, he stood now looking at the Dutchman. Yet Diels was unlike his NSDAP mentor Göring. Firstly, he was not, and never was, a member of the party, and secondly, he maintained an ability to think logically, even if that logic was often cruel and calculated. Logic, something that often escaped the NSDAP hierarchy. Diels remembered the Dutchman later, when he penned his memoirs, Lucifer ante Portas, in 1949. His upper body naked, sweating and smeared with dirt, he sat in front of them, breathing heavily. He was gasping for breath as if he had just completed a tremendous task. A wild look of triumph was in the burning eyes of the pale, emaciated young face. I sat opposite him a few times more that night at police headquarters and listened to his confused stories. I read the communist leaflets that he carried with him in his trouser pocket. They were of the kind that were being publicly distributed everywhere in those days. Diels noted. The frank confessions of Marinus van der Lubbe could in no way lead me to think that such a little fire-raiser, who knew his crazy business so well, needed helpers. Why shouldn't just a single match suffice to set light to the cold, flammable pomp of plenary chamber, the old upholstered furniture, and heavy curtains and the bone-dry wooden splendor of the paneling? But this specialist employed a whole rucksack full of incendiary devices. Unter den Linden was lit not only with the street lamps, but also with the light emanating from the windows of the great hotels beyond, the Adlon and the Bristol, as well as the Staatsbibliothek, within which Hans Flüter had been studying earlier that evening. But it was not the glow of these lights that lit the face of Rudolf Diels that night as he left the interrogation of Marinus van der Lubbe at the Brandenburger Tor. Nor was it the lights of the black Mercedes 770 that careered past him as he returned to the scene of the crime. Rather, it was the bright glow erupting ahead. A glow of a fire burning at a few thousand degrees within the Reichstag.
Achtung, Achtung. Hier ist die Sendestelle Berlin im Voxhaus. Meine Damen und Herren.
Welcome to the Achtung History Podcast, written and presented by myself, Simon J. James. This week, the Reichstag, Episode 3, Retribution. Reichskanzler Hitler and the Berlin Gauleiter Goebbels arrived shortly after 10 in the evening of the 27th of February, 1933, in front of the Reichstag. The street around the building was busy with the fire trucks from Platoon 6 of the Stettiner Feuerhaus of Linienstrasse and Platoon 7 from Turmstrasse. The black tarmac that covered the road reflected much of the light of the fire as the water spewed from the hoses that the firemen wrestled with, trickling out from the building as fire chiefs Klotz and Püller directed their men to contain the fire within the plenary hall. It had been half an hour since the plenary hall had exploded into flame in a great backdraft. Sven Felix Kellerhoff, in his book Der Reichstagsbrand, Die Karriere eines Kriminalfalls, writes of the backdraft. On February 27, 1933, at around 9:27 p.m., a phenomenon known and feared today as backdraft should have occurred, which occurs in fires in closed rooms. Initially, an open fire consumes a large part of the available oxygen. When the flames go out, the sharply increased temperatures lead to the chemical phenomenon of pyrolysis. Organic molecules split, unoxidized, i.e. flammable gases rise and collect under the ceiling. At the same time, the temperature drops slightly due to the now only smoldering areas of fire. This creates a vacuum that draws in air as soon as possible. If, in this situation, oxygen enters the previously closed room, a catastrophe can hardly be averted.
After opening a door, the accumulated heat initially seems to be forced out like a blow. But immediately afterwards, a strong draft forms inside the now open fire room. The oxygen mixes with the hot smoke gases in a few seconds to more than a minute, depending on the size of the room. As soon as the mixture is ignitable, a flue gas explosion occurs, which can develop temperatures of up to 10,000 degrees and can no longer be brought under control.
Oberbrandmeister Puller notes there is no saving of the plenary hall, but the crews can attempt to contain the fire within the halls. Numerous fire lines run up the steps, some wind around spiral staircases, others leak water on the polished marble floors untainted by the flames, and they continue to do so as the clock moves past 10. The black Mercedes 770 pulls up to the southern entrance of the Reichstag, and quickly Hitler and Goebbels leave the car. Portal 2 lies just before them. The windows of the Parliament building are aglow with the light produced by the Great Fire, but they are not the first of the NSDAP hierarchy to have arrived. Diels, it is often noted, was the first on the scene, but, not being an NSDAP party member and not a politician, he can be excluded from the NSDAP hierarchy. It was instead the man whom had taken the young Rheinisches man under his wing, the bombastic Hermann Göring. Göring was present as Hitler and Goebbels entered the Reichstag, with historian Hans Mommsen writing, "Göring greeted the VIPs as they arrived." It was as if it was the highlight of the Wagnerian festivals, the elite of the new German Reich exiting from their black limousines, but instead of the Osram bulbs illuminating the night with a spectacle, it was rather the burning down of the last vestibules of German republicanism and democracy. Göring, as head of the police, first order was to secure the area. Enacting the powers that had stripped the police force of its republican elements and flooding it with the sympathizers of National Socialism, the order went out that none present within the area would be allowed to leave. He himself had already made a tour of the burning building. Within, he had encountered the NSDAP Member of Parliament Herbert Albrecht and member of the Economic Committee, whom himself had been scouting out the fire. Skranowitz, the house inspector of the Reichstag, whom had, with a police officer, discovered Marinus van der Lubbe in the Bismarcksaal, was ranting and raving that the fire was a well-organized arson attack and that there must be more perpetrators to be found, especially considering, according to Skranowitz, that 6 people had been injured in the flames. Although how this becomes comprehensible logic is beyond reason. Skranowitz had been made aware of the communist propaganda in the pockets of Marinus van der Lubbe, and as he recants this to Albrecht and to Göring, the decision as to whom was responsible for the fire is made. As Göring therefore shakes the hands of Hitler and Goebbels as they enter toward the building, Goebbels and Göring even remaining cordial to one another, Göring is already spewing the unreserved statement that the fire was certainly, and without a doubt, the result of the communists. Now in the building, the snaking hoses at their feet, Hitler, Göring, Goebbels and Albrecht are joined by the Vice-Chancellor and the dictator of Prussia, Franz von Papen. Goebbels writes of his first impressions.
Thick fire hoses lead up through Portal 2 into the large lobby. There is no doubt that the Commune is making a last attempt to cause confusion by fire and terror in order to seize power in the general panic. Now the decisive moment has come. Göring is on a roll. The Führer does not lose his composure for a moment. It is admirable to see him giving his orders here, the same man who half an hour ago was sitting with us at dinner, chatting carefree. The plenum is a picture of desolation. The flames are leaping up to the ceiling, which threatens to collapse at any moment.
Stood on a balcony, the leaders of the new German Reich watched as the democracy of the Second Reich and the republic that followed, although far from perfect, but had safeguarded in many aspects the liberty and freedom of its citizens, burned to the ground. Hitler was incredulous with excitement. The flames before him presented the opportunities to rebuild from the ashes a Germany without his enemies, a Germany where none could stand in his way or the way of his party. The flames fueled the ideas of the Führerprinzip, where all power would be embodied in him, It fanned the ideas of the Gleichschaltung, where power would be reorganized to have its center within the NSDAP party that in turn supported the Führerprinzip. It just so happened that at that moment, someone else arrived to the proverbial party. Ludwig Grauert, born 9th of January 1891 in Münster, had been appointed as the Ministerial Director der Polizeiabteilung des Preußischen Innenministeriums, or Ministerial Director of the Police Division of the Prussian Ministry of the Interior, on the 22nd of February, the day that Hitler had ranted and raged about the Marxist threat, and that Göring had announced that the Hilfspolizei could suppress Republican and Communist elements with absolute brutality and with full impunity. Grout had taken on these responsibilities himself, pursuing these newly undesirable elements within the Interior Ministry of Prussia. He had cleaned house of those who might propose a resistance, illegally, to the new regime, and supported those whom were, like himself, newly embellished by the NSDAP, such as the later architect of the Holocaust, Hans Globke. Grauert was quick to point a finger at two of the Reichstag deputies whom had been in the building that day, Ernst Torgler and a deputy, Köhnen. Ernst Torgler was an ideal target. In 1927, he had been made deputy chairman of the KPD, the Kommunistische Partei Deutschlands, and in 1929 rose to become its chairman. In 1932, he became editor alongside Wilhelm Pieck of a KPD newspaper, the Red Voter. Other Reichstag officials whom had made their way into the burning building by the names of Hornemann and Kull supported the words of Grauert, and the conspiracy grew. Meanwhile, an inspector with the Berlin Fire Department, Assessor Schnitzler, had already begun an inspection of the building. With the fire platoons holding the fire to the plenary hall, Schnitzler had begun his investigation in the rooms where the nests of flames had already been subdued. His conclusion: the fire was set by just one person, acting quickly and swiftly. Göring had, in the meantime, dispatched his press agent, Martin Sommerfeld, to assess the situation as it stood with the culprit, Marinus van der Lubbe, to gather the details to which the police had already been able to establish and report back. Göring, Hitler and Goebbels, as well as the others who felt it safe enough to stand not close to the flames, but rather to Hitler, debated how many must have set the fire. Their logic persisted that to create such a great fire, it would require many people. They lacked, as they would prove throughout their 12-year reign of terror, all understanding of science and refused to see the fire as the effects of the building acting as a great chimney fueling itself, but the fire being the result of the culmination of a large number of communists acting against Germany. It was on this that Diels was asked to report, and Diels later reminisced.
Hitler had propped himself upon the stone parapet of the balcony with both arms and stared silently into the sea of red flames. The first storms lay behind him. As I entered, Göring walked towards me. In his voice lay the whole ominous emotionalism of that dramatic hour. This is the beginning of the communist uprising. Now they'll strike out. There's not a minute to waste. Göring could not continue. Hitler turned to the assembled company. I now saw that his face was flaming red with excitement and from the heat that was gathered in the cupola. He shouted as if he wanted to burst, in an unrestrained way such as I had not previously experienced with him. There will be no more mercy now. Anyone who stands in our way will be butchered. The German people won't have any understanding for leniency. Every communist functionary will be shot where he is found. The communist deputies must be hanged this very night. Everybody in league with the communists is to be arrested. Against Social Democrats and Reichsbanner, there will be no mercy. I reported the first results of my interrogation of Marinus van der Lubbe, that in my opinion he was a madman. This, to he, mocked my childish credulity. It's a really ingenious, long-prepared thing. These criminals have worked it out very nicely. But they've miscalculated, haven't they, my party comrades? These subhumans don't suspect at all how much the people are on our side. In their mouse holes from which they want to come out, they don't hear anything of the rejoicing of the masses. And so on it went. I asked Göring to step aside, but he didn't let me speak. highest emergency footing for the police, ruthless use of firearms, and everything else that follows in such case for major military alarm. Orders.
Göring and the other leaders would hear nothing of the arguments against their illogical calculations. With Grauert's report on Torgler, a known communist, being in the building on the 27th, despite the fact Torgler was a member of the Reichstag, it stood that there must have been more. Göring began speculating to the number of communists who must have been involved. The first number, he theorized, judging by the height and size of the fire, was 30. He even began speculating as to how they may have fled. He had ordered the area to be closed down by the police, but maybe the perpetrators had fled through the tunnels below ground. There had been rumors before of communist-led assassination plots that were to make use of these underground tunnels to attack himself. Torgler's character was also coming under increased pressure. The NSDAP deputy Berthold Carvarner and SS cell leader Kurt Frey continued the accusations against Torgler, stating without foundation that they were aware that Torgler had met with the arsonist and had witnessed Torgler leaving in a hurry from the burning building just moments before Hitler himself had arrived. They were fueling the fire further as they told the leaders what the leaders wished to hear, therefore attempting to prove their loyalty and worth in the new Germany. The accusations against Torgler, the size of the flames, the number of nests that had been created, the want to eradicate the opposition had deafened the ears of the NSDAP leadership. All these motions that had come before, Hitler's speeches, the law signed by Hindenburg for the protection of the German people that had given power to the police to curtail the rights of assembly, the police that had been violated with the Hilfspolizei, and the placement of von Levetzow at its head had been steps towards destroying the support for the opposition parties. Now the fire was the chance to destroy the parties themselves. At 1 a.m., Martin Sommerfeld returned. He presented what he had discovered to Göring. 1 perpetrator, 30 nests of fire. Communist paraphernalia, but no membership card. Göring responded to the information by shouting him down. In an unrestrained manner, Göring retorted to, according to Hans Mommsen,
change the information regarding the amount of fire material and the number of perpetrators, and reacted to Sommerfeld's objections with the outburst, "Nothing is impossible. 1 man, that wasn't 1 man. That was 10, 20 men. Man, don't you want to understand? That was the communists. That's the signal for the communist uprising. The beacon. Here we go."
Göring disregarded the report from Sommerfeld and dictated one anew. Disregard van der Lubbe as the sole perpetrator, change the number of alleged accomplices to 7, and there it was set. They were looking for 7 people, and Torgler was certainly one of them. Grauert at this point reappears in the sequence of events of that fateful evening. It has never been fully established as to when the work with which Grauert returns was prepared. However, its consequences are evident in history. Grauert had re-emerged, proposing the adoption of an emergency ordinance against arson and acts of terrorism. Grauert was proposing a complete crippling of the opposition and the powers they might have. Many factories, mines, and power plants still had a strong base that leaned toward the left, but not restricted to the communists. But Grauert and many others knew, especially the police president von Levetzow, how powerful these bases could become considering the events of the Kapp-Luttwitz putsch of 1920 that had been crippled by a general strike. Now with a new putsch proposed by those in power, Grauert was attempting to ensure that the method that was used to crush the previous push could not be used again. If there was one issue, however, with Grauert's proposals, it was that they were not far-reaching enough. So as the NSDAP elite began to leave the burning symbol of democracy, the Reichstag, as Goebbels went towards his Gau officers on Hedemannstrasse, Göring ordered the arrest of Torgler, and from somewhere drew a list of thousands of known communists whom were to be arrested. So as the cars and vans of the Berlin police, bolstered by those awarded them by the Hilfspolizei, stormed out into the dead of night to awaken those still sleeping, not knowing of the fire that was about to spell their downfall, Minister of the Interior, the only ministry seat granted to Hitler's NSDAP in the cabinet of the 30th of January 1933, Frick, went toward the Reich Ministry of the Interior and began drafting a decree, once again under the most infamous of articles, number 48, that would change everything. The decree read,
Decree of the President of the Reich for the protection of the people and the state. 28th of February, 1933. On the basis of Article 48 of the Reich Constitution, the following is decreed for the prevention of acts of violence threatening the state by communists. Section 1. Articles 114, 115, 117, 118, 123, 124, and 153 of the Constitution of the German Reich are suspended until further notice. Therefore, restrictions of personal freedom, of the right of free speech, including freedom of the press, of the right of association and assembly, interference with the secrecy of correspondence, mail, telegraph, and telephone, orders of house searches and seizures, as well as restrictions of property, are permissible even outside the legal limits otherwise determined for this purpose. Section 2. If the measures necessary to restore public safety and order are not taken in a land, the Reich government may temporarily exercise the powers of the Supreme Land Authority in this respect.
This point is important towards the later Gleichschaltung of power, as the states, the lands, powers were undermined, effectively meaning that the states could do whatever they wished, as long as it's what the government in Berlin wanted them to do.
Section 3. The authorities of the lands and municipalities, associations of municipalities, shall comply with the orders the Reich government issued on the basis of Section 2 within the scope of their competence. Section 4. Whoever contravenes the orders issued by the Supreme Land Authorities or the authorities subordinated to them for the implementation of this ordinance, or the orders issued by the Reich government in accordance with Section 2, or whoever incites or encourages such contravention, shall, unless the act is punishable by a more severe penalty under other provisions, be punished by imprisonment for not less than 1 month, or by a fine of 150 to 15,000 Reichsmarks. Whoever causes a common danger to human life by an offence according to paragraph 1 shall be punished with imprisonment. In extenuating circumstances, with imprisonment of not less than 6 months, and, if the offence causes the death of a human being, with death. In extenuating circumstances, with imprisonment of not less than 2 years. In addition, confiscation of property may be imposed. Any person who incites or encourages any offence, dangerous to the public, Section 2, shall be punished by imprisonment, or in extenuating circumstances, by imprisonment for a term of less than 3 months. Section 5. Crimes punishable by death are those which the Criminal Code in Subsection 81, high treason, 229, poisoning, 207, arson, 311, explosion, 312, flooding, 315, paragraph 2, damage to railway installations, 325, dangerous poisoning, punished with life imprisonment. The following shall be punished by death, or, in so far as a more severe penalty has not previously been threatened, by life imprisonment, or by imprisonment for not more than 15 years. Subsection 1. Whoever undertakes to kill the President of the Reich, or a member of the Commissioner of the Government of the Reich, or a land government, or whoever incites, offers, or accepts such a request, or conspires with another to commit such a killing. Subsection 2. Whoever, in the case of Section 115, Subsection 2 of the Criminal Code, aggravated sedition, or Section 123, Subsection 2 of the Criminal Code, aggravated breach of the peace, commits the act with weapons or in conscious and deliberate collaboration with an armed person. Subsection 3. Whoever commits a deprivation of liberty, as according to Section 239 of the Criminal Code, with the intention of using the persons deprived of his liberty as a hostage in a political struggle. Section 6. This ordinance shall enter into force on the day of promulgation. Berlin, 28th of February, 1933. Signed, the President of the Reich, von Hindenburg, the Reich Chancellor, Adolf Hitler, the Reich Minister of the Interior, Frick, and the Reich Minister of Justice, Dr. Gürtner.
For those whom the police were currently driving toward their doors, it meant that the rights that they had when they stepped into bed that evening, not to be detained indefinitely without reason, were now gone. Soon the prisons at Alexanderplatz, Moabit, Lehrterstrasse, and Spandau, amongst others, were filling with the names not only of communists, but those deemed an enemy of the NSDAP, or a danger. Names such as Alfred Apfel, Fritz Ausländer, Rudolf Bernstein, Egon Erwin Kisch, Karl von Ossietzky, Wilhelm Pieck, and Werner Scholem all could count themselves lucky that Diels and the Prussian police had not taken Göring's order to shoot without impunity as an actual order. It is important to note that it was not only in Berlin that the NSDAP allowed their wrath to run rampant. In Hanover, for example, over 140 Communist Party functionaries were arrested in those early hours of the morning of the 28th of February 1933. And due to the lack of use of the Hilfspolizei, these functionaries were not mistreated beyond their surprise incarceration. A meeting is held at the Kaiserhof amongst the leaders of the NSDAP, most notably Hitler and Goebbels, and the discussion turns quickly to how the fire might be used for the benefit of the party. How can the last vestibules of support for the communists or their sympathizers, or even for the centre-left Social Democrats, be broken or swayed toward the National Socialist Revolution? From the Kaiserhof and the Wilhelmplatz, they both drive to the offices of the NSDAP newspaper, the Völkisches Beobachter. The Völkisches Beobachter's offices were not a long drive. In earnest, they were less than 800 meters away. But in these offices, within the red brick facade of a former market hall and dance hall, they both had the space to think. Goebbels went to think on his own, scratching out the headlines that would fill the front page of Der Angriff, whilst Hitler sat down and dictated the words which he wished to fill the minds of all the German people. Until the clocks finally ticked to 5 in the morning, the pair worked, their words dripping with poison onto the paper. Not even 12 hours had passed since the first sighting of the Dutch communist Marinus van der Lubbe scaling the building. But soon Hitler and Goebbels would manufacture a communist conspiracy that threatened the very nation and would be presented to the only office higher than Hitler in the land, that of Reichspräsident Paul von Hindenburg. At 11 a.m., the Reichskabinet gathered. The cabinet was still dominated by the other nationalist parties. Here, the NSDAP were, despite holding office of Chancellor, in the minority. Yet they need not be concerned. There was little opposition amongst the nationalist cabinet towards the invoking of the powers of Article 48, nor was opposition to when Hitler unequivocally stated the laws of state should be disregarded so that the communist threat might be truly eliminated. The minutes of the meeting read,
The Reich Chancellor stated that a ruthless confrontation with the KPD was now urgently called for. The psychologically right moment for the confrontation had now come. It was pointless to wait here. The KPD was determined to the utmost. The fight against them must not be made dependent on legal considerations.
Göring, present as a minister without office, further laid down support for the theory that, despite van der Lubbe's own confession of acting alone, there were at least 6 or 7 others whom had helped set the fire to the Reichstag. He further iterated intentions that he had conjured that the communists were supposedly to carry out.
I have been informed that the communist side intends to shut down the lighting network and traffic, as well as all other vital large-scale enterprises by means of acts of violence or sabotage, which are to take place in the very near future. Explosives for carrying out the acts of sabotage are to be available in sufficient quantities. The Rotfront-Kämpferbund are instructed to make immediate use of the firearm in any case of clashes with members of national units.
Göring's fanciful charges would later that day be printed in a Prussian government statement, remembering that Prussia was a nationalist dictatorship afforded to Franz von Papen. It was the end of the garbage chute of Göring's fantasies. It read,
Government buildings, museums, mansions, and essential plants were to be burned down. Women and children were to be sent in front of terrorist groups. The burning of the Reichstag was to be the signal for a bloody insurrection and civil war. It has been ascertained that today was to have seen throughout Germany terrorist acts against individual persons, against private property, and against the life and limb of the peaceful population, and also the beginning of general civil war.
The cabinet convened, yet the work was far from over. Göring and Hitler then made the short journey to the presidential palace on Wilhelmstrasse and briefed the president on the current situation, which included informing Hindenburg that over 150,000 kilos of explosives have been siphoned off or stolen from army supplies and were now in the hands of the KPD. All of this had the purpose of swinging the upcoming election. Hitler, Göring, and Goebbels all wished to sway the moderate voters from the Social Democrats and Centre parties, guiding them towards themselves by placing a fear in the conscience of the people to what the KPD might have in store for Germany. Göring equally gave further carte blanche to the SS and SA when he unleashed those rabid dogs onto the streets to arrest those associated with the communists. On the 3rd of March, in a speech made in Frankfurt am Main, Göring emphasized this point.
Fellow Germans, my measures will not be crippled by any judicial thinking. I don't have to worry about justice. My mission is only to destroy and exterminate, nothing more. Certainly, I shall use the power of the state and the police to the utmost. My dear communists, don't draw any false conclusions, but the struggle to the death, in which my fist will grasp your necks, I shall lead with those down there, the brown shirts.
But for the SA and SS, it was not only the Communist Party functionaries they were after, it was for all those whom had become enemies or a stumbling block in their paths. Quickly, the SA and SS deployed as Hilfspolizei, and without limits on the brutality they could employ, swamped the streets of Berlin and other cities across Germany. The cellars of their clubhouses and favoured bars became illegal detention centres, as did abandoned halls and factory buildings. Those who had been an enemy, as the KPD supporters had engaged with the NSDAP in street battles like those that had often occurred on Danziger Allee, where the NSDAP restaurant on the corner with Treschow-Strasse faced a KPD restaurant on the corner with Lischner Strasse, the patrons of which often meeting in brawls of the fist. In the red districts of Wedding and Friedrichshain, temporary camps sprung up overnight. In Prenzlauer Berg, the water tower that still dominates, that in daytime casts a shadow over the monumental Reichstag synagogue, found its first use as a camp. For many in the cities, especially those who lay within a moderate political spectrum, it was their first taste of fear. It wasn't a fear that existed in Moscow, the fear of a dreaded knock on the door. Rather, it was a fear that the door might explode and the brutes in brown might clamber through, truncheon in hand. For the communists who might rally together and expose the NSDAP propaganda for what it was, they were faced, in holding a public rally, with the full consequences of Göring's wanting for violence. On the 2nd of March, the Berlin police president von Levetzow, the papers announced, had issued a full and unchallengeable ban on the gatherings of the KPD, as was his right under the implementation of the decree of the President of the Reich for the protection of the German people, dated February 4th, 1933, that was covered in episode 1 of this series. The KPD organizations and all of its supportive groups were equally treated with further bans. Steadily the prisons grew in their population. Also on the 28th of February, Göring had issued an arrest warrant for Ernst Torgler, whom had been accused of, according to Hans Mommsen, on the unverified false statements of Carvana, Frey, and Kreuer. Torgler, perhaps to deny Göring an arrest, had turned himself in against the wishes of the KPD, the party of which he was chairman. Goebbels, on the eve of the 28th, once again turned to his diary and wrote,
I write an effective poster against the KPD and SPD. No more Marxist newspapers appear throughout the Reich. Göring has opened a great campaign in Prussia against the Red parties. It will end with a complete destruction. The cabinet has passed a very harsh decree against the KPD. This decree provides for the death penalty. This is also necessary. The people are demanding it now. Arrests are being made upon arrests. Now the Red Plague is being wiped out tooth and nail. Resistance is nowhere to be seen. The opposing camp seems to be so stunned by our sudden and sharp crackdown that it no longer dares to resist. I look at the consequences of the night of the fire in the Reichstag. The plenum presents a single picture of devastation, debris upon debris. This will cost the KPD dearly. There is indescribable indignation throughout the people over this cowardly attack. Now the work is going on by itself. The worst is over. The hopefully last glitch has been happily overcome. A few more days, and then we will be able to celebrate our great triumph. It is a pleasure to live again.
The coming elections were never far from the minds of the NSDAP. It was the continuation of their duality of the NSDAP state. As the fists of the SS and SA turned towards the punching bags, their enemies now embodied, the state put out statements in the paper that reassured that those arrested were treated fairly under the law. The Berlin Morgenpost wrote on its front page,
As reported by the competent authorities, only a part of the persons arrested in connection with the government action against the KPD and its functionaries are being held in the cellular prison in Lehrterstrasse. The majority are being held in the police prison in Dirksenstrasse. The judicial authorities, which have already received numerous applications for permission to speak on behalf of the arrested persons, state that the applications will only be dealt with by the political police and the police headquarters. The censorship of letters for the protective detainees is also carried out by the political police. Otherwise, persons taken into protective custody may receive visits from their relatives after permission has been obtained, but in the presence of police officers. They are also given newspapers and other reading material, insofar as it is not covered by the ban. As far as food is concerned, those taken into protective custody are fed by the police prison or the prison in Lehrterstrasse. They can also, like prisoners on remand, obtain food and additional catering at their own expense.
it was to appear that the NSDAP and police were treating those arrested fairly, so not as to frighten those who, in fearing the conjured KPD actions, might not be turned away from supporting the NSDAP. Hitler quickly resumed, after the fire had burnt out, his election campaign, travelling by plane to speak in cities across the Reich. He was in Breslau on the 1st, Berlin once again on the 2nd, giving a speech in the Sportspalast, Hamburg on the 3rd, and on the 4th in the old Prussian capital of Königsberg. So as thousands of Germans languished in cells and water towers, factories and basements in the hands of the corrupted police or of the SS and SA, Hitler spoke to the gathered crowds in Königsberg. Here, to brown shirts and red armbands, party officials and the curious, he shouted and berated and repeated the threat that the KPD and Marxism presented on this, the Tag der Erwachenden Nation, this day of the awakening nation, where the folk would open their eyes to the threats posed. Yet, whilst he screamed, his fists clenching and stamping upon the lectern, the people remained blind to the greatest threat Germany had ever seen, the one that stood before them. This has been The Reichstag, Retribution, a podcast by Achtung History, written, presented, and produced by myself, Simon J. James. Join me again next time when the Reichstag fire turns to elections, concentration, and trials. For more from Achtung History, become a patron for as little as €1 a month by visiting patreon.com/Achtung History. And follow on Twitter and Instagram for updates at Achtung History. Once again, thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.